On Thanksgiving Day, 2010, three young brothers spent what should have been a joyful holiday with their father in Morenci, Michigan. 9-year-old Andrew, 7-year-old Alexander, and 5-year-old Tanner were there one moment, gone the next. For 15 years, investigators found nothing. No trace of the boys, no answers, no closure. The case went cold, but the questions never stopped haunting the small town near the Michigan-Ohio border. What their father told police would change everything they thought they knew about that Thanksgiving weekend. The truth was closer than anyone had imagined. Before we dive into today's story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe to Seek Stories for more mysterious disappearance cases. Morenci, Michigan, is the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. A small town nestled along the Michigan-Ohio border, about 100 miles southwest of Detroit, with a population barely reaching 2,000. The kind of community where neighbors wave from their porches, where kids ride bikes down quiet streets without a second thought, where Friday night high school football games draw half the town. It's a place that values family, faith, and community above all else. The Skelton family seemed to fit right in. John Russell Skelton and Tanya Lynn Zuvers married in 2002. They settled in Morenci, became active members of the United Methodist Church, and started building what looked like a typical American family. John worked as a long-haul truck driver, spending days or sometimes weeks on the road, hauling cargo across state lines. It was demanding work that kept him away from home, but it paid the bills. Tanya stayed home with the boys, embracing motherhood with the kind of dedication that friends and family noticed. She would later say it was her dream job, the greatest job in the world. Andrew Ryan Skelton was born first. By 2010, he was 9 years old, standing about 4 feet 1 inch tall with short brown hair and brown eyes that sparkled with curiosity. He was smart, observant, the kind of kid who asked questions about everything. Alexander William Skelton, who went by Alex, was 7. He was shorter than his brother, about 3 feet 9 inches, with the same brown hair and brown eyes. He wore glasses that sometimes slipped down his nose when he played. He had scars, one on his chin and another near his hairline, the kind of marks active boys collect from falls and childhood adventures. Tanner Lucas Skelton was the youngest at just 5 years old. Where his brothers had brown hair, Tanner's was strawberry blonde, catching the light like copper. His eyes were blue, bright and innocent. He stood 3 feet 6 inches tall and weighed about 40 pounds. The three boys attended Morenci Elementary School. Andrew was in 1st grade, Alexander in 3rd grade, and Tanner in kindergarten. Teachers described them as well-behaved, friendly kids who got along with their classmates. The kind of children who made their mother beam with pride at parent-teacher conferences. But beneath the surface of this ordinary family, something was breaking. By 2010, the marriage between John and Tanya had begun to crumble. The kind of slow fracture that starts with small disagreements and grows into something neither person can repair. John was gone for long stretches with his trucking job. Tanya was home alone with 3 young boys, managing everything by herself. The distance between them, both physical and emotional, widened with each passing month. Then came September 13th, 2010. That morning, Tanya filed for divorce. Her primary concern was custody. With John's job taking him away for extended periods, she argued she should have the boys full-time. She wanted to protect them, keep their lives stable, give them the security they deserved. That very same day, something happened that would foreshadow the nightmare to come. John went to the boys' elementary school and signed Andrew and Alexander out of class. He told school officials he was taking them on a trip to Florida, where his parents lived. But there was something odd about the way he said it. He implied they might not be coming back. He suggested the school might need to forward the children's records. When Tanya found out, panic seized her chest. She immediately called the police. Frantic phone calls were made. Authorities contacted John, and under threat of arrest, they convinced him to bring the boys back to Michigan before crossing state lines. The boys were returned to their mother's care safely. No charges were filed. It seemed like a close call, a custody dispute that got out of hand. Nothing more. But Tanya knew, deep in that place where parental instinct lives, she knew something wasn't right. After this incident, The divorce proceedings intensified. It became contentious, filled with accusations flying between both sides. John filed for custody, bringing up Tanya's past. In the late 1990s, she had been charged with fourth-degree criminal misconduct involving a 14-year-old boy. She was 32 at the time, and it resulted in her being listed as a registered sex offender. John used this to argue she shouldn't have custody of their sons. Tanya countered by emphasizing John's frequent absences. How could someone who was barely home be the primary caregiver? The court sided with Tanya. She was granted sole custody of Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner. But the judge also granted John visitation rights. The couple reached an agreement outside of court. The boys would spend time with their father on scheduled visits. Supervised access. Nothing that should have been dangerous. Everything seemed settled. But 2010 was a difficult year for John Skelton in more ways than the divorce. Around the time the custody battle was being decided, he lost his trucking job. The steady income that had supported his family for years was gone. His marriage was ending. His children would live with their mother. His life as he had known it was falling apart. November 25th rolled around. Thanksgiving Day. John had the boys for a court-ordered visitation. Tanya agreed to let them spend the holiday with their father. It was Thanksgiving, after all. Time for family. The boys were excited. They knew that after the holiday, the whole family was planning to attend a local high school football game. There would be shopping for fan gear, time with extended family, the kind of wholesome small-town activities that make childhood memories. Tanya dropped the boys off at John's home in Morenci. She kissed each of them goodbye, told them she loved them, made plans to pick them up the next morning. She had no idea it would be the last time she would ever see her sons. The last confirmed sighting of Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton was at 5 o'clock on the evening of November 25, 2010. Neighbors saw the three boys playing in the backyard of their father's home in Morenci. It was Thanksgiving Day, and the air held that particular chill that comes with late November in Michigan. The kind of cold that bites at your cheeks but doesn't stop kids from running around, their breath forming little clouds in the air. The boys seemed happy. They chased each other across the yard, their voices carrying over the fence. Just three brothers being brothers. Nothing seemed wrong. Nothing seemed dangerous. Inside the house, John Skelton was alone with his sons for the first time since the custody ruling. What happened in those following hours remains one of the most haunting mysteries in Michigan history. Friday morning, November 26th, the day after Thanksgiving. Black Friday. Tanya Zuvers woke up that morning thinking about her boys, eager to see them, ready to hear about their Thanksgiving with their father. She tried to reach John to coordinate the pickup. She called his phone. No answer. She tried again, and again. Each time, the phone rang through to voicemail. The silence on the other end felt wrong. That maternal instinct, the one that had warned her back in September, started screaming now. Tanya drove to John's house. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tight, knuckles white, as worst-case scenarios played through her mind. She told herself she was overreacting. There had to be a simple explanation. Maybe his phone died. Maybe he overslept. Maybe the boys were so tired from yesterday they needed extra rest. She pulled up to the house. The windows were dark. No movement inside. No sounds of children. No John. She knocked on the door. Nothing. She knocked harder, called out their names. The house stayed silent. Something was very, very wrong. Tanya called the police. Officer Ryan Hillard from the Morenci Police Department arrived at the scene. Together, they tried to piece together where John and the boys might be. Hillard made calls, checked records, reached out to local hospitals. That's when they found him. John Skelton was found at a nearby hospital, not in Morenci. He had checked himself in with a broken ankle. When hospital staff asked what had happened, John told them the injury occurred during an attempted suicide the night before. Investigators later described the explanation as deeply troubling, especially given what would soon be discovered at his home. The attempt was unsuccessful, resulting in a severe ankle injury rather than the outcome he claimed to have intended. The boys? No one knew where the boys were. Police immediately entered John's home with probable cause. What they found inside would haunt investigators for years to come. The house showed clear signs of disturbance. Broken glass covered parts of the floor, and several household items appeared to have been deliberately damaged. Appliance cords had been cut, suggesting the destruction was not accidental. Investigators later described the scene as controlled and intentional, reflecting a highly unstable state of mind. Evidence inside the home appeared to support John's earlier statements to authorities, though specific details were not publicly emphasized. Additional items found throughout the house further raised concerns about what may have occurred that night. But it was two other discoveries that caused investigators to pause, realizing the situation was far more serious than initially believed. On a table sat a Bible open to a specific page. One verse had been carefully circled in pen. The exact passage has never been publicly released, but investigators later noted that its content added to their growing concern about John's mindset in the days leading up to the disappearance. And there was a note, a handwritten message apparently left for Tanya. The words were simple, devastating in their simplicity. "You will hate me forever, and I know this." FBI Special Agent Corey Burris would later testify that this note represented something crucial. That was his passive admission, Burris said, his voice steady but his meaning clear. A passive admission to what exactly? The agent didn't need to spell it out. But where were Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner? At the hospital, John Skelton was placed under psychiatric evaluation. Police officers approached his bedside, notebooks in hand, recording devices running. They needed answers. 3 children were missing, and this man was the last person to see them alive. John's story started simply enough. The boys were fine, he insisted. They were with friends. They would be back soon. Don't worry about them. They're safe. But which friends? The investigators pressed him. Give us names. Tell us where they are. We need to verify the boys are okay. John's story shifted. Actually, he said he didn't leave them with friends exactly. He had given them to a woman he had met online several years ago. Her name was Joan Taylor. He trusted her. She was going to bring the boys back to their mother. Everything was arranged. Everything was fine. Investigators immediately began searching for Joan Taylor. They combed through online records, social media, any trace of a woman by that name who might have had contact with John Skelton. DMV records, property records, anything that might lead them to this mysterious figure. Joan Taylor didn't exist. There was no record of her anywhere. No digital footprint, no paper trail, no evidence she had ever crossed paths with John Skelton. The story was a fabrication, a smokescreen, and investigators knew it. They confronted John with this information. Your story doesn't check out, they told him. Joan Taylor isn't real. Where are your sons? John's story shifted again. He changed his narrative, this time spinning a tale that sounded like something out of a thriller novel. He hadn't given the boys to Joan Taylor, he admitted. That was a mistake, a confusion. What he had actually done was hand his sons over to an underground organization, a group dedicated to protecting children. He mentioned activists, people who help families in crisis, possibly connected to the Amish community. This group, he insisted, would keep the boys safe from their mother. He was protecting them from abuse, from danger. He was being a good father. Investigators listened to this new version with growing frustration. Which organization? Where are they located? How do we contact them? We need names, John. We need addresses. We need something we can verify. John couldn't or wouldn't provide details. The organization was underground, he explained. That's the point. They operate in secrecy. They have to protect the children they're hiding. He couldn't identify them even if he wanted to. That's how it works. But one thing was clear from his phone records. While John was telling these shifting stories from his hospital bed, investigators were tracking his movements through cell phone tower data. Technology doesn't lie. It creates a digital breadcrumb trail, pinging off towers, marking locations with timestamps. At 4:29 in the morning on November 26th, the morning after Thanksgiving, John Skelton's phone began transmitting from Morenci. Then it started moving, southwest, toward Ohio. By 4:30, his signal was picked up by a tower near Holiday City, Ohio, roughly 20 to 25 miles from his home. The phone traveled along the Ohio Turnpike. Then, at approximately 6:06 a.m., the phone was turned off. The signal went dark. For hours, there was nothing. No pings, no data, no way to track where John went next. At approximately 8:45 a.m., the phone powered back on. It was back in Morenci, Michigan. John had been gone for roughly 2 hours and 15 minutes. Maybe less. A window of time where anything could have happened. What did he do during those hours? Where did he go? What was he doing in Ohio at 4:30 in the morning, in the cold darkness of November, when his 3 sons should have been asleep in their beds? Law enforcement mobilized immediately. Michigan State Police coordinated with Ohio authorities. They needed to search that area. If John had been in Holiday City, Ohio, there had to be a reason. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Teams of officers combed through woods, fields, and abandoned structures. The search focused on areas near the Ohio Turnpike, near Lazy River Campground, near anywhere John's phone had pinged that morning. They searched an old schoolhouse in Kunkel, Ohio, based on one of John's later statements. They checked a dumpster in Holiday City, following another tip from his ever-changing narrative. They found nothing. No clothing, no toys, no sign that 3 young boys had ever been in those locations. The dogs didn't alert. The ground searches turned up nothing. It was as if Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner had simply vanished into thin air. An Amber Alert was issued across Michigan and Ohio. The faces of 3 young boys, smiling in photographs, appeared on television screens, highway billboards, and social media feeds. Missing children. Last seen with their father. If you have any information, please contact authorities immediately. The community of Morenci rallied. Hundreds of volunteers showed up to help search. The schools offered buses to transport search parties to remote locations. People walked shoulder to shoulder through fields, calling out the boys' names, hoping against hope for some response. Day after day, the searches continued. Dawn to dusk, through cold November weather, volunteers refused to give up. Police Chief Larry Weeks held a press conference. His face was drawn, exhausted, the weight of the case visible in every line. Based on the information we have, he said, choosing his words carefully, we do not anticipate a positive outcome here. Those words hit the community like a physical blow. Not anticipate a positive outcome. In the language of law enforcement, it was as close as they could come to saying what everyone feared. The Skelton brothers weren't missing. They weren't hiding. They were gone. On November 30th, 5 days after the boys were last seen, the FBI took John Skelton into custody. He was charged with 3 counts of felony parental kidnapping, 3 counts of kidnapping, and 3 counts of unlawful imprisonment. The charges were serious, carrying the potential for life in prison if convicted. But still, John wouldn't talk. Not really. Not in any way that helped investigators find his sons. While he sat in jail, the searches continued. Winter was coming to Michigan. Soon, snow would cover the ground, making searches nearly impossible. Time was running out. Then came the testimony that would change everything. Weeks after the disappearance, John's church pastor came forward and described a conversation he had with John shortly after the boys vanished. According to the pastor, he asked John directly what had happened to Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner. John's response, the pastor said, was brief and deeply unsettling. He told the pastor that he had sent them home. When pressed to explain what he meant, John did not provide a clear answer. The pastor later told authorities that John's wording raised serious concerns about the boys' fate. In the weeks and months following that Thanksgiving weekend, the investigation into the disappearance of the Skelton brothers became one of the most intensive missing persons cases in Michigan history. Multiple agencies worked together. The Morenci Police Department, Michigan State Police, the FBI, and law enforcement from Ohio all coordinated their efforts, following every lead, chasing down every tip, refusing to give up. Detective Lieutenant Jeremy Brewer with Michigan State Police became the lead investigator on the case. Over the next 15 years, He would dedicate countless hours to finding Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner. The case would become a defining part of his career, a puzzle that refused to be solved, a tragedy that demanded answers. Brewer and his team knew that the 2-hour window on the morning of November 26th was crucial. That time frame between John leaving Morenci at 4:29 a.m. and returning at approximately 8:45 a.m. represented their best chance of discovering what happened to the boys. They began reconstructing John's movements with painstaking detail. The phone records placed him near Holiday City, Ohio, specifically near the Lazy River campground area. This location is about 20 miles from Morenci, accessible via back roads that wind through rural farmland. At that hour of the morning in late November, those roads would have been completely deserted. No witnesses, no traffic, just darkness and cold. Investigators theorized that John could have driven to this area with the boys, possibly with their bodies, and disposed of them somewhere in the vast expanses of wooded land and water that characterized the region. But this raised an agonizing question. With only 2 hours and 15 minutes, how much ground could he have covered? How far could he have traveled off the main roads? And more importantly, where exactly should they search? The area around Holiday City is rural Ohio at its most sprawling. Thick woods, abandoned barns, old farm equipment rusting in fields, private property stretching for acres with no fencing, streams and ponds scattered across the landscape like jewels. Thousands upon thousands of potential locations where 3 small bodies could be hidden. The search was like looking for a specific grain of sand on a beach. Teams used every resource available. Cadaver dogs were brought in repeatedly, their sensitive noses trained to detect human remains. They walked through woods, across fields, along the banks of every body of water within a reasonable radius of where John's phone had pinged. The dogs worked methodically, but the cold weather of late November and early winter complicated their efforts. Scent disperses differently in cold air, and the passage of time makes detection more difficult. Divers searched ponds, lakes, and streams. The water was frigid, visibility poor, but they went down anyway, feeling along muddy bottoms, searching for anything that might provide answers. They found old tires, rusted bicycles, the typical debris that accumulates in rural waterways. But no trace of the boys. Ground-penetrating radar was employed in certain areas, looking for disturbed earth that might indicate a burial site. The technology can detect anomalies underground, changes in soil density that suggest something has been buried. They found old septic systems, forgotten foundations from demolished structures, and animal remains. Nothing that led to Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner. Helicopter searches provided aerial views, allowing observers to spot areas of interest from above. They looked for freshly disturbed earth, unusual patterns in vegetation, anything out of place in the rural landscape. The searches continued for weeks, then months. Nothing. While the physical searches consumed resources and manpower, investigators also worked to build their case against John Skelton from a different angle. If they couldn't find the boys, they needed to understand exactly what had happened in that house on Thanksgiving night. They needed to piece together the timeline, the evidence, and John's state of mind. The condition of John's home provided crucial insight. The destruction inside wasn't random chaos. It reflected the actions of someone overwhelmed and in psychological distress. Broken glass and deliberately severed electrical cords suggested a scene shaped by intent rather than impulse, painting a picture of a man who had reached a breaking point. The Bible with the circled verse became a focal point of further analysis. Religious references in the context of family violence often signal a particular mindset. Was John experiencing some kind of psychotic break? Did he believe he was saving his sons from something? The circled verse, whatever it said, suggested premeditation, planning, a decision made with thought rather than impulse. The note to Tanya, "You will hate me forever and I know this," indicated awareness of his actions. This wasn't a man who had lost touch with reality completely. He knew what he had done would be unforgivable. He knew Tanya would hate him. He accepted this as the consequence of whatever choice he had made. Investigators also examined John's background more closely, looking for anything that might explain the disappearance. They spoke with family members, friends, co-workers, anyone who had known John Skelton before that Thanksgiving. What emerged was a portrait of a man under immense stress. The loss of his trucking job had been a significant blow. For a man whose identity was wrapped up in being a provider, unemployment represented more than just lost income. It was a loss of purpose, of structure, of self-worth. The divorce proceedings had been contentious and painful. He was losing his children, the boys he loved, to a custody arrangement that would make him a part-time father at best. The accusation he had made about Tanya's past, using her sex offender status as ammunition in the custody battle, suggested desperation rather than genuine concern. Some people who knew John described him as a devoted father who loved his boys. Others noted that his long absences for work had always strained his relationship with them. He missed baseball games, school events, bedtime stories. The time he did have with them was precious, but it was also limited. The divorce meant even less time, structured visits, supervised access. But loving your children and harming them aren't mutually exclusive. History shows that, in rare cases of extreme psychological distress, individuals may harm those closest to them. Mental health professionals use the term familicide to describe these types of family-related tragedies, which are often associated with a personal crisis, a loss of perceived control, and deeply distorted beliefs about what outcomes are possible. Did John fit this profile? The failed suicide attempt certainly suggested it. The noose, the broken ankle, the preparation visible in the destroyed house, all pointed toward someone who had planned to take his own life after doing something irreversible. But if John had harmed his sons and attempted suicide, why had he survived? Why call for medical help? Why go to the hospital? These questions plagued investigators. If his plan was to join his sons in death, why seek treatment for his broken ankle? One theory suggested that John's nerve had failed at the last moment. Perhaps after doing whatever he had done to the boys, the reality of his actions crashed down on him. Perhaps the physical pain of the broken ankle overwhelmed his determination to die. Perhaps, in the cold light of morning, with his sons gone and the deed done, he simply couldn't go through with taking his own life. In July of 2011, John Skelton accepted a plea deal. Rather than face trial on the original charges of parental kidnapping and kidnapping, which carried the possibility of life in prison, he pleaded no contest to 3 counts of unlawful imprisonment. It was a strategic decision on his part, one that limited his maximum sentence to 10 to 15 years. During the plea hearing, the prosecutor made one final appeal. They offered John a chance to come clean, to tell them where the boys were, to give Tanya the closure she desperately needed. In exchange, they suggested they would consider his cooperation during sentencing. John remained silent. He offered no new information, no confession, no location where bodies might be found. On September 15, 2011, John Skelton was sentenced to 10 to 15 years in prison. He was sent to Bellamy Creek Correctional Facility in Ionia, Michigan, roughly halfway between Lansing and Grand Rapids. The sentence meant he could be eligible for parole after 10 years, with a maximum release date in November of 2025, exactly 15 years after the boys disappeared. For Tanya Zuvers, the sentencing brought no relief. Her sons were still missing. John was going to prison, yes, but that didn't bring Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner home. The questions remained unanswered. The investigation continued, even with John behind bars. Tips came in regularly. Someone would call saying they saw 3 boys matching the description in another state. Someone else would report seeing children who seemed out of place, who seemed afraid, who might be the Skeltons. Every tip had to be followed up, every lead investigated, no matter how unlikely. In December of 2017, a potential breakthrough sent shockwaves through the case. Remains were discovered in Missoula, Montana, in a storage shed. The bones appeared to belong to 3 children, aged roughly 2 to 10 years old. The discovery was modern, not ancient, and the initial anthropological assessment suggested the bones were from the last several years. Could this be Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner? The news reached Tanya. After 7 years of wondering, of hoping, of fearing, there might finally be an answer. DNA testing was ordered immediately. The wait for results felt interminable, days stretching into weeks as the lab processed the samples. In prison, John Skelton was asked about the Montana discovery. His response was telling. "Yeah, those are not my boys," he said, rolling his eyes at the suggestion. The dismissive tone, the certainty in his voice, suggested he knew exactly where his sons were, and it wasn't Montana. The DNA results came back. The remains were not a match for the Skelton brothers. They belonged to other children, victims of some other tragedy, but not Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner. The lead evaporated, leaving investigators back at square one. Over the years in prison, John gave occasional interviews. His stories continued to evolve and shift, but never in ways that actually helped the investigation. Sometimes he talked about the underground organization again, insisting they existed, but he couldn't reveal their identity because it would compromise their mission. Other times, he mentioned the Amish community specifically, suggesting they were involved in protecting children from abusive situations. He painted himself as a hero of sorts, a father who had made a difficult sacrifice to save his sons from a terrible fate. Investigators reached out to Amish communities, asking if anyone had knowledge of 3 English boys being taken in around Thanksgiving of 2010. The response was universal. No such boys existed. The Amish community, while private and protective of their own, would never participate in hiding children from legal custody arrangements. The story was another fabrication. In 2018, John gave an interview to a local news station. He claimed he had given the boys to 2 women and 1 man who were part of a network that relocated children to farms in Ohio. These people, he said, understood that he was trying to protect his sons. They had agreed to take them somewhere safe, somewhere Tanya couldn't find them, somewhere they could grow up away from the abuse he believed they were suffering. But once again, he couldn't provide names. He couldn't provide locations. He couldn't provide any verifiable information that would allow investigators to confirm even a single detail of his story. Every claim he made led nowhere, a maze of dead ends designed, it seemed, to frustrate and confuse rather than illuminate. Detective Lieutenant Jeremy Brewer spent years studying John Skelton, watching interviews, reading transcripts, trying to understand the psychology of the man. In a 2020 interview, Brewer was asked point-blank whether he believed John was responsible for his son's disappearance. His response was unequivocal. "I have no doubt whatsoever," Brewer said, his voice carrying the weight of a decade of investigation. "No doubt whatsoever that John Skelton responsible for what happened to his sons." It was the closest thing to an official declaration that investigators believed the boys were deceased and John was responsible. But belief isn't proof. Certainty isn't evidence. And without bodies, without a crime scene, without a confession, prosecutors couldn't charge John with anything beyond the unlawful imprisonment conviction he was already serving. The calendar marched forward. 2011 turned to 2012, then 2013. The boys would have been teenagers by then, growing up somewhere, learning to drive, going to high school dances if they were alive. Tanya held on to hope, the way mothers do. But it was a hope that grew more painful with each passing year. Every year on Thanksgiving, the anniversary of the boys' disappearance, Tanya attended a vigil in Wakefield Park in Morenci. In 2012, the municipality installed a memorial plaque bearing the images of Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner. The inscription reads, "Faith, hope, love." The plaque remains in the park, a permanent reminder that these 3 boys lived, that they mattered, that their community hasn't forgotten them. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children periodically released age progression images showing what the boys might look like as they grew older. In 2020, they released images showing Andrew at 19, Alexander at 17, and Tanner at 15. The digital artists did their best to imagine how the boys' faces would have matured, how their features would have changed, whether they would have favored their father or mother in their appearance. These age progression photos were distributed widely, shared on social media, posted on missing persons websites, broadcast on true crime television programs. The hope was that someone somewhere might recognize one of the boys. Maybe they were alive somewhere under different names. Maybe someone had seen them and could provide a lead. But no credible sightings ever emerged. No one came forward with information that advanced the case. The age progression photos served mainly to remind the public that the boys would still be children growing into young men if they were alive. That time continued to pass for everyone except Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner, frozen forever in photographs from 2010. As John's release date approached, Tanya faced an impossible decision. In Michigan, a person can be declared legally dead after being missing for 5 years. The boys had been gone for more than a decade. Declaring them dead was a formality, a legal necessity for closing estates and moving forward with certain types of administrative matters. But for a mother, declaring your children dead feels like giving up. It feels like accepting defeat. After much agonizing, much discussion with family and friends, Tanya filed a petition in Lenawee County Probate Court to have Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner declared legally dead. The hearing was scheduled for March of 2025. On March 5, 2025, nearly 15 years after the boys vanished, Judge Catherine Sala presided over one of the most emotionally devastating hearings in Lenawee County history. Tanya Zuvers sat in the courtroom, surrounded by family, as law enforcement officials testified about the investigation, the evidence, and their conclusions about what happened to her sons. Former Morenci Police Chief Larry Weeks testified about the initial days of the investigation. FBI Special Agent Corey Burris described the condition of John's home, the note, the Bible, the evidence that pointed toward something terrible. Detective Lieutenant Jeremy Brewer provided a comprehensive overview of 15 years of investigative work, the thousands of man-hours, the countless dead ends, the frustration of knowing who was responsible, but being unable to prove it definitively. John Skelton did not appear at the hearing. He remained in prison, scheduled for release in November of that year. Judge Sala listened carefully to all the testimony. She reviewed the evidence presented. She considered the legal standards required for declaring someone deceased. And then she delivered her ruling. She granted the petition to declare Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton legally deceased, with the date of death listed as 5 years after their disappearance, as required by Michigan law. But she made a crucial distinction. She found that while the boys were deceased, the evidence presented did not meet the standard of clear and convincing proof of exactly what John Skelton had done. It was enough to declare them deceased, but not enough, legally speaking, to definitively state how they perished. The ruling was a painful middle ground. The boys were officially declared gone, but the legal limbo around exactly what happened to them remained. For Tanya, it meant closure in one sense and continued agony in another. Her sons were legally dead, but justice still felt out of reach. Tanya released a statement after the ruling. Her words reflected 15 years of grief, anger, hope, and heartbreak. This decision came after much thought and discussion with my family and friends, she wrote. It did not come lightly and was definitely a difficult decision to make. No parent wants to lose a child, but to have the court step in and declare them deceased is just unfathomable. The months following the declaration were difficult for Tanya and her family. They had lived in limbo for so long that even this painful legal acknowledgement felt momentous. They could now move forward with certain administrative matters, but the emotional wound remained as raw as ever. Meanwhile, John Skelton's release date loomed. His 10 to 15-year sentence would be complete in November of 2025. The prospect of him walking free, possibly without ever revealing what he did with Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner, was unbearable for Tanya and the community that had never stopped searching. But then something shifted. Throughout his incarceration, authorities had continued to build a case. The pastor's testimony about John saying he sent the boys home to heaven had always been damning, but it hadn't been enough for prosecutors to file homicide charges without bodies. Michigan law allows for prosecution of homicide without a victim's remains, but such cases are notoriously difficult. Prosecutors need overwhelming evidence, a clear timeline, proof that the person is deceased and not simply missing, and a compelling argument that connects the defendant to the death beyond reasonable doubt. For 15 years, prosecutors in Lenawee County had been working toward that threshold. Every piece of evidence was documented. Every statement John made was recorded. Every inconsistency in his stories was cataloged. They built a circumstantial case, the kind that hinges not on a smoking gun but on the accumulation of evidence that points inexorably toward guilt. In 2025, prosecutors made their decision. After the legal declaration of the boys' deaths, After 15 years of investigation, they decided they had enough to move forward. On June 5th, John Skelton was charged with 3 counts of second-degree murder. Each count represented one of his sons, Andrew, Alexander, Tanner. The charges meant that even after his release from prison on the unlawful imprisonment conviction, John would face trial for taking the lives of his children. If convicted, he would face life in prison. When prosecutors announced the charges, Lenawee County Prosecutor John Pulaski explained the timing. "The declaration of death created a legal foundation we needed," he said. "We always believed John was responsible, but now we have the legal framework to pursue justice for these boys." The indictment detailed the evidence against John, the timeline of that Thanksgiving weekend, the condition of the house, the failed suicide attempt, the note and the Bible verse, the cell phone records showing the trip to Ohio in the early morning hours, the constantly shifting stories that never led anywhere, the pastor's testimony about being sent home, the absence of any credible evidence that the boys were alive anywhere in the world. Taken individually, some of these pieces might seem inconclusive, but assembled together, prosecutors argued, they told a clear story. John Skelton had done something to his sons on or around November 25, 2010. He had then attempted to cover up what he had done by disposing of evidence, possibly including their remains, during that 2-hour window in Ohio. He had attempted to take his own life, failed, and then constructed a series of lies to prevent anyone from finding out what really happened. The community reaction to the charges was overwhelming. After 15 years of waiting, of hoping for answers, of watching a man who everyone believed was responsible potentially walk free, there was finally movement toward accountability. Vigils were held outside the Lenawee County Courthouse. Ribbons in blue, red, and orange, representing each of the 3 boys, appeared throughout Morenci. Tanya released another statement. "While nothing can bring my babies back," she said, her voice breaking, "knowing that John will face justice for what he did is something I never thought I'd see. These charges are for Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner. They deserve justice. They deserve to be remembered. And John deserves to face what he did." John's attorney argued that the charges were unjust, that prosecutors were bowing to public pressure, that the lack of bodies meant reasonable doubt would always exist. "Where is the physical evidence?" the attorney demanded. "Where are the remains? How can you convict someone of murder when you don't even have proof of death?" But prosecutors countered that the accumulation of circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. Plenty of people have been convicted in similar cases without remains being recovered. The legal standard doesn't require physical evidence of a victim. It requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt that the crime occurred and that the defendant was responsible. As the case moves toward trial, the questions that have haunted Michigan for 15 years remain. Where are Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton? What exactly did their father do to them? Where did he hide them? Will their remains ever be found? The answers may lie somewhere in rural Ohio, buried in woods that stretch for miles, submerged in waters that have kept their secrets for over a decade. Or the answers may be locked inside John Skelton's mind, secrets he has guarded for 15 years and may guard until his death. The disappearance of Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton represents one of the most heartbreaking unsolved missing persons cases in American history. For 15 years, their faces have been synonymous with the pain of families who never get answers, who live in perpetual uncertainty, who can never truly grieve because a part of them keeps hoping. Tanya Zuvers has spent the last 15 years navigating a nightmare that most people cannot imagine. She has been a tireless advocate for missing children, working with organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to raise awareness. She has spoken at conferences, appeared in documentaries, shared her story countless times in the hope that it might help another family, or that someone, somewhere, might come forward with information about her boys. Every Thanksgiving, the anniversary of the disappearance, brings renewed media attention. Local news stations run retrospectives. National crime programs revisit the case. Each time, Tanya participates in interviews, shows recent photos of herself so the public can see the toll this has taken, and makes the same plea she has made for 15 years. If you know anything, please come forward. If John told you something, anything, please don't keep that secret. These boys deserve to be found. They deserve to be brought home. The Skelton Brothers case has also highlighted gaps in the legal system. How is it possible that someone can take 3 children, refuse to say what happened to them, serve only a decade in prison, and walk free? Advocates for missing children have pointed to this case as an example of why laws need to be strengthened. Some have called for federal legislation that would make it a separate crime to refuse to disclose the location of a missing person's remains. The psychological impact on the community of Morenci has been profound. This is a small town where violent crime is rare, where people pride themselves on being safe, on looking out for each other. The fact that 3 boys could vanish from their own home on a holiday in broad daylight in some sense shattered that sense of security. Parents became more vigilant. Custody disputes became more fraught with fear. The shadows that fell over Morenci on Thanksgiving 2010 have never fully lifted. Detective Lieutenant Jeremy Brewer retired in 2023, but the Skelton case remained unfinished business. In interviews after his retirement, he expressed frustration that despite years of dedicated work, the boys were never found. "I think about them all the time," he said. Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner. 3 kids who deserve to grow up. "I hope before I die someone finds them. They deserve to be laid to rest properly." Tanya deserves that closure. The upcoming trial will be closely watched. It will force John Skelton to face the evidence against him in a public forum. His ever-changing stories will be dissected. Expert witnesses will testify about forensic evidence, about behavioral analysis, about the patterns seen in family violence cases. The jury will have to decide whether the circumstantial case is strong enough to reach a verdict. But regardless of the trial's outcome, some questions may never be answered. If John continues to maintain his silence about where the boys are, if he takes that information to his grave, Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner may never be found. The woods of Ohio, the fields of Michigan, the countless possible locations will keep their secrets. 3 boys with their whole lives ahead of them. Andrew, who should be 24 years old now, possibly finishing college or starting a career. Alexander, who should be 22, finding his place in the world. Tanner, who should be 20, discovering adulthood. Instead, they exist only in photographs, in memories, in the hearts of a mother who refuses to stop fighting for them. The search continues. Even now, even 15 years later, tips are investigated. New technology in forensics and search techniques offers hope that something might be found. But as each year passes, the likelihood dims. The Skelton Brothers case may ultimately join the ranks of those American mysteries that are never fully solved, questions that echo through time without answers. For Tanya, the fight for justice continues. The trial represents a step toward accountability, but the real closure she seeks can only come one way, bringing her boys home. And so she waits. She hopes, she grieves, and she refuses to let the world forget Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton. Because every child deserves to be remembered. Every child deserves justice. And every mother deserves answers.